What's up guys, Jeff from Sorta Healthy here. We're back at it again. It's time to pass the NASM exam. In today's video, we'll be covering a number of different topics that will 100% be on that final test. We'll be diving into overactive and underactive muscles, the overhead squat assessment. To be honest, we'll be covering pretty much all the NASM assessments and much more. Sorta Healthy has already helped thousands of trainers pass this exam, and that's because on this channel we focus on the things that are most likely to be on the test and we make them very simple. Throughout today's video, we'll be referencing a study guide. This guide is free to download at this link located down below in the video description. All I ask in return for this free video and guide is that you like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. This channel is a free resource for all fitness professionals, and your support is what allows us to keep making free content like this for all of you. Thank you so much for that support, everyone. I really do appreciate it. Onto the video. So I don't work for NASM, I want to make that clear right away. Also, this is a part 2 video. It doesn't really matter what order you watch these two videos in. In all likelihood, you'll be watching them both a handful of times, so if you're here watching this one first, keep watching, finish this one, just make sure you go watch this other one later. Alright, so first off, we are going to cover some very basic anatomy. You're likely to get a few questions on very basic anatomy, but nothing too crazy. So anyway, there's 206 bones in the human body. The axial skeleton has 80 bones, and that is the core of the body, and that includes the skull, the ears, the neck, the back, and the ribcage. You also have the appendicular skeleton, and that has 126 bones, and that's the limbs or the appendages. So within your body you have osteoblasts, and these are cells that build or repair bone. The opposite of that is an osteoclast, and those destroy bone. What is the longest bone in the body? That is the femur, or this upper leg bone that you can kind of see in this picture over here. The patella or kneecap is a sesamoid bone, which you can see the patella or kneecap right here. So there are four main types of bones: long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. Sesamoid bones, like the kneecap we just described, would often be kind of lumped into irregular bones. So the human movement system, or kinetic chain, is made up of the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the nervous system. So the skeletal system provides support and protects organs. It's the body's foundation. It makes blood for the body, and it stores necessary minerals. The muscular system links the nervous and skeletal systems together. It allows for movement, and there are three different types of muscle. You have skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is muscle that you have direct control over. So if I'm doing this motion right here, my biceps are doing that motion. My biceps would be skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle would be things internal. For example, you have smooth muscle in your stomach and other organs. And cardiac muscle is in the heart. And again, skeletal muscle is the one that we have direct control over. The other two, not so much. So synovial joints are the most common in the body, and there are a few different types of synovial joints. So your radius and ulna, these two arm bones right here, they form a pivot joint because they kind of pivot around like that. Now your knee, or actually your elbow here too, those are hinge joints because they kind of just hinge forwards and backwards in one direction. Condyloid joints, don't really have to worry too much about those, but you have some in your hand and your fingers, for example. Saddle and plane joints, don't really need to know too much about those. Ball and socket joints, well, you have one right here in your shoulder, also your hip, and they allow for a whole bunch of different ranges of motion. Moving on to the central and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. It's responsible for receiving, processing, and responding to sensory information. The peripheral nervous system is made up of nerves that extend from the spine to all other parts of the body, and they send info back to the CNS, or the central nervous system. Some good vocab to go over real quick here. Definitely could pop up on the test. A neuron is a basic unit of the nervous system. A neuron has an axon, a cell body, and dendrites, and it allows you to do everything from breathing to running, pretty much anything. A sarcomere is the basic contractile unit of a muscle fiber, good to know, and a motor unit is made up of a motor neuron and the muscle fibers it innervates. Onto some nervous system stuff. You have the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system, meaning it kind of just kicks on whether we want it to or not. And the sympathetic nervous system is pretty much all about the fight or flight response. You can see this dude over here, he's ready to fight. You might also be ready to run away from something dangerous too. Fight or flight, sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is also part of the autonomic nervous system, meaning it just kind of kicks on automatically, automatically. And that one's all about resting and digesting. So these two are kind of opposite to one another. Parasympathetic, rest and digest. The somatic nervous system allows you to control your body's movements and receive external stimuli. So unlike the sympathetic and parasympathetic, you do have control over your somatic. So the sliding filament theory is basically just the theory of how muscles contract. So the sliding filament theory is when actin and myosin is larger by the way, slide past each other to generate movement. So myosin, again the larger of the two, and actin sliding past each other and kind of ratcheting to one another. Again, it kind of works like microscopic Velcro, and that is what's happening inside of your muscles to generate movement. This does occur in the sarcomere, which we just said is the basic muscle unit. Speaking of muscle fibers, you have type 1 muscle fibers and type 2 muscle fibers. Type 1 muscle fibers are slow twitch, they are more important for endurance events, they're lighter and less powerful, and they're mostly aerobic, and that means oftentimes fat and just food in general, that's going to be fuel for these muscles. Then you have type 2 muscle fibers. They're fast twitch, they're larger and paler than type 1. They're anaerobic, meaning they don't require oxygen, and they're really used for short, explosive periods of physical activity, so sprints, heavy lifts, things like that. And they use carbs, glucose, things like that as fuel. So arteries carry oxygen-rich blood away from the heart to the rest of the body. I repeat, arteries carry oxygen-rich blood away from the heart to the rest of the body. Veins carry deoxygenated blood from the body to the heart, where it goes to the lungs to be reoxygenated. So veins are carrying deoxygenated blood, no oxygen in the veins. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels and the site of exchange for nutrients, oxygen, CO2, things like that, and they provide nutrients to the tissues. Moving on to some basic heart stuff, you have 4 different heart chambers, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom. Right atrium and left atrium are on the top, and your right ventricle and left ventricle are on the bottom. The atria are smaller and they kind of serve as blood reservoirs, and the ventricles on the bottom are bigger. So we're going to go into some of this stuff in more detail in a second, but the right atria receives deoxygenated blood from the body. The left ventricle pumps oxygen-rich blood to the body through the aorta, and the SA node, the sinoatrial node, is the pacemaker of the heart. Next up, we're going to talk about blood flow through the heart. I'm going to keep things as simple as possible, and in all likelihood, you'll get 1 or 2 questions about this on the test. Okay, so I've broken down blood flow through the heart into 5 different steps. In step 1, oxygen poor blood, or blood that doesn't have any oxygen in it, enters the right atrium, and the right atrium is this part of the heart right here. So in step 2, the blood flows through the right ventricle, and the right ventricle is right beneath the right atrium. In step 3, blood is pumped to the lungs from the right ventricle, so the right ventricle is sending blood to the lungs to get reoxygenated. In step 4, the oxygenated blood returns to the heart, and then in step 5, that oxygenated blood goes from the left atrium to the left ventricle. You can see the left atrium, left ventricle over here, and the left ventricle pumps the blood that now has oxygen inside of it to the entire body. Important to know that last bit, the left ventricle is pumping the blood with oxygen inside of it to the entire body. I wouldn't say all of this is worth memorizing. It is worth looking over a few times because, like I said before, you are likely to get a question or 2 about this on that final test. Next up, we're talking about kinetic chain checkpoints, and these are the things that you're going to be looking at for the upcoming posture analysis, and you'll be looking at it for upcoming assessments as well. So whether you're analyzing someone's posture or doing an assessment, you're going to want to look at that person's feet and ankles, their knees, their lumbopelvic hip complex, the hips, their shoulders, and their head and neck. Moving to some postural deviations. Next, we have a lordotic posture, a kyphotic posture, a sway back posture, a flat back posture, and a scoliosis posture. The 2 that we're going to be focusing on here are these first 2, this overly lordotic posture and this overly kyphotic posture. We're all supposed to have a lordotic curve. See this curve right down here in this person's lower back? Yeah, you're supposed to have a lordotic curve in your lower back. However, if that lordotic curve becomes too great, too excessive, it can cause some problems. So this overly lordotic curve, and we can see it again right down here, this is called lower cross syndrome. And yes, it does look like you're sticking your butt out for Instagram, but yeah, when your lower back is rounding this much right here, as you can see, lower crossed syndrome. So as we can see here with lower cross syndrome again, this lordotic curve is too great. Ideally, we just have a small lordotic curve like you can see right here. So when someone has lower cross syndrome or their lordotic curve is too great, as we can see right here, the hip flexors and lumbar extensors are too tight and short. they would be considered overactive. Your hip extensors, glutes and hamstrings, and your core muscles are lengthened and weakened or underactive. This overly kyphotic posture is another one that NASM could ask you about. We're all supposed to have a kyphotic curve up here. However, if that curve becomes too great, that can cause some problems. So yes, like we just said, if you see a rounded forward posture like this, or a kyphotic curve that is too great, you are looking at upper crossed syndrome. And if we're looking at an overly kyphotic posture or upper cross syndrome, like we can see right here, the anterior chest, your pecs, your shoulder muscles, lats, and neck extensors are too tight and shortened. And overactive muscles need to be stretched out. We have some underactive muscles here too, like the rhomboids, the lower and middle traps, the neck flexors. Again, those are weakened, so those we want to focus on strengthening. And I'm just going to keep beating this into your heads here because you're likely to get a question or two. This right here, upper cross syndrome, and we just talked about the overactive and underactive muscles that you should know for upper cross syndrome. So we've kind of already talked about anterior pelvic tilt. It usually occurs alongside a lordotic posture as well as kyphosis. So typically an overly lordotic posture or a lower cross syndrome, again where this lordotic curve is too great, that's going to happen at the same time as an overly kyphotic posture or upper cross syndrome. When we're looking at anterior pelvic tilt specifically, it is almost exactly the same thing as lower cross syndrome. So what you're looking at here is short and tight muscles on the front side. These are the hip flexors. Long, taut, and weakened, that would be the hamstrings and the glutes. Those guys you would have to strengthen. Again, these hip flexors on the front side you would want to stretch. The core would be weak, so you'd want to strengthen that. And these lumbar extensors on the back side, we'd want to kind of stretch those guys out. I'm just going to repeat all of that for you guys listening. Anterior pelvic tilt is pretty much the same thing as lower cross syndrome. You have the hip flexors that are too tight and short, so you're going to want to stretch those guys out. Glutes and hamstrings, you're going to want to strengthen those guys because they're underactive. So the core muscles here are long, taut, and weakened, so those guys we want to strengthen. And these lumbar extensors, those are short and tight, so those we want to stretch. So forward head posture and upper cross syndrome are very related to one another. If someone has upper cross syndrome, kind of like this, slouched, hunched over, their head is typically going to go forward a little bit too. So if you have forward head posture or upper cross syndrome, the overactive muscles or the muscles that we want to stretch are the cervical spine extensors, the upper traps, the pecs, the sternocleidomastoid or SCM, and the levator scapula, which elevates your scapula. Again, these guys are overactive, so we want to stretch them out. Underactive muscles for upper cross syndrome and the forward head posture, we have the cervical flexors. These are the muscles in the front of the neck. We have the rhomboids, and these are muscles in the lower shoulders. They help to kind of pull everything back. We have the lower and middle traps. These are muscles in kind of the lower back part of the shoulder blade area. The lower traps in particular are going to be underactive. Keep that in mind. Upper cross syndrome, lower traps in particular underactive. That means they need to be strengthened. Now, because the cervical spine extensors are overactive, essentially they need to be stretched. That would mean the deep neck flexors would be underactive because they're on the opposite side and they have to be strengthened. So what causes upper and lower cross syndrome? Well, poor lifestyle choices are typically the cause. If you have a desk job where you're seated slouching all day, you're far more likely to have postural problems. Sitting like this too much will cause underactive glutes, hamstrings, and core muscles, and overactive things that need to be stretched like the pecs, hip flexors, and other front side muscles as well. Now that we've covered a bunch of background information, it's time to get into assessments. Some assessments like the overhead squat are super important, and we'll spend a good amount of time going over those. Other assessments are less important, and those ones we're just going to cover briefly. And without wasting any time, jumping right into the overhead squat, typically, this is the first movement assessment done. The overhead squat assesses dynamic posture, core stability, and neuromuscular control. And it is a good way to spot muscle imbalances such as knee valgus, which we're going to talk much more about that one very soon, limited ankle mobility, etc. A little more information on the overhead squat, and you don't have to memorize any of this stuff, but we're just going to be going over basically how you would set this up. You're going to start off with the client standing on a flat and stable surface. Their feet should be shoulder width apart and they should be pointing straight ahead. The feet and ankles should be in a neutral position, and the assessment should be performed with shoes off to better view the client's foot and ankle complex. And the client should have their elbows fully extended with their arms completely overhead. In terms of depth for the overhead squat, your client should attempt to be squatting to parallel, where the femur, being that big upper leg bone, is parallel with the ground. That being said, a lot of clients won't be able to achieve that depth, and in that case you can reduce it if necessary. The client will perform roughly 5 reps while the trainer views from the front and from the side. This number here can vary a little bit if necessary, and you do want to view from the front and from the side just so you can see what's going on from multiple angles. Okay, so when we're viewing the overhead squat from the anterior or the front, we're looking at the feet and the ankles, and we're also looking at the knees. If your client were to actually perform this movement perfectly, their feet should stay straight ahead as they're performing their reps. Also, if your client were performing their reps perfectly, their knees should track straight forward over the second and third toes. We do also want to view the overhead squat from the side or the lateral viewpoint, and from that lateral viewpoint, we're going to be viewing the lumbopelvic hip complex, the hips, and we're going to be viewing the shoulders from the side as well. Now we're going to be going over some examples of where a client does an overhead squat, but they don't do the movement exactly perfect, aka overactive and underactive muscles. You don't necessarily have to memorize everything we're about to go over, but you should pretty much understand everything I'm explaining. So if you have a client doing an overhead squat and their feet are turning out kind of like what you can see right here, the overactive muscles in this case would be the gastrocnemius and the soleus, and these muscles exist on the backside of your calf, and the hamstring muscles would also be overactive in this instance as well. The underactive muscles would be the tibialis muscles, the anterior and posterior, and these are basically the muscles on the front side of your shin. Then the glutes would also be underactive in this situation as well. You're going to notice that the glutes are going to be underactive in a lot of the upcoming movement pattern discrepancies. Also, just as a rule of thumb for all of the upcoming examples, if muscles are overactive, generally speaking, that means we want to stretch them out or loosen them. And if muscles are underactive, generally speaking, that means we want to strengthen them. So now let's talk about a client who's doing the overhead squat assessment and their knees cave in kind of like this. In that case, the overactive muscles would be the TFL, the tensor fascia lata, and the adductors. The TFL is a muscle that's right above the IT band. It kind of sits on the side of the hip there. And the adductors, those are the muscles that kind of bring the leg back towards the body. Also, a lot of the time, the TFL opposes the glute muscles, so you'll notice that if the TFL is overactive, essentially the glutes, they're going to be underactive. So yeah, if the knees are caving in, the glutes are going to be underactive, as well as the anterior and posterior tibialis. Now, if a client's low back arches when they're doing their overhead squat, which would look something a little bit like this, some of their overactive muscles would likely be their hip flexors, their lumbar extensors, and their lats. When it comes to muscles that would be underactive in this case, we have glute max, we have the hamstrings, and we have the abdominals. And again, you don't necessarily need to memorize all of this stuff. Something that's useful to know is that if muscles on one side of the body are overactive, then in all likelihood, muscles on the opposite side of the body, those are going to be underactive. And we can see that here with the hip flexors being overactive and the hamstrings being underactive. Same thing here with the abdominals being underactive and the lumbar extensors being overactive. Now, if a client is doing an overhead squat and they're leaning way too far forward, it's a little bit of a funky picture right there. Really, you can only see her upper body, but yeah, she's leaning too far forward as she's doing the overhead squat. Again, overactive would be the hip flexors, the gastroc and soleus, the calf muscles. Overactive would also be the core muscles, at least the outermost core muscles, the rectus abdominis and the external obliques. And then when it comes to the underactive muscles, again, we have the glute max and we have the hamstrings. And then we also do have the lumbar extensors in this case too. And the last of these overactive and underactive slides for the overhead squat is when the arms fall forward. And when it comes to the overactive muscles, we're thinking about the lats, the pecs, and teres major, which that is a shoulder muscle. And pretty much all of that stuff should make sense when we're thinking back to our upper and lower cross syndrome examples that we discussed earlier in today's video. And they kind of should make sense for all of these other patterns as well. So make sure you understand all of that because that will help you understand these overactive and underactive muscles. Next up, we have the single leg squat assessment, and you won't be doing this one with all clients. It is somewhat advanced, so if you're concerned that your client will be able to balance on one leg, this would not be the assessment for them. To some extent, how deep you go here does depend on the client. It's also kind of hard to tell from this picture, but you're only squatting down to about 60 degrees of range of motion at the knee, so it's not like it's a 90-degree angle where it would be for the previous overhead squat. So again, you're not going down quite as far as before with that previous assessment. Anyways, for the single leg squat, there is strong inter and intra-rater reliability, meaning that this test is easy to repeat and get similar results, whether it's you repeating the test multiple times or multiple trainers doing the test. We only need to worry about an anterior view or a view of the front side of the body for this one. Up to 5 reps will be completed for both sides. This number can vary a little bit person to person. The client squats as deep as possible while maintaining balance and returns to the starting position. Anyways, the single leg squat continued. The client stands on a flat, stable surface with hands on their hips and their eyes focused forward. The client lifts one foot approximately 6 inches off of the floor. The foot, the ankle, and the knee should be in a neutral, straight ahead position. The only overactive and underactive thing we have to think about here is the knee kind of caving inwards. It's a little bit tough to see in this picture, but her knee is just kind of caving inwards a little bit towards the other side. And if we're thinking about the overactive muscles in this case, the adductors, again, that makes sense because the knee is being added too much back towards the midline of the body. The TFL is typically going to be a problem in situations like this. And if we go down here, we can see that the glute max and glute medius, those are going to be underactive because again, they kind of just oppose that TFL. So if the TFL is overactive, you know that these two are almost always going to be underactive. And just like in a lot of other cases, the anterior and posterior tib are also underactive here as well. In our part 1 video on passing your CPT exam, we talked about someone who was squatting and leaning too far forward. Another faulty squat pattern they could ask you about is when a client is squatting but their legs are kind of buckling together like we can see in this picture right here. There's a few things going on here, but if you see this pop up in any form on the test, you know the main reason for this happening is that the adductors are too strong and tight relative to the abductors. Basically, the glutes, mainly glute medius, is too weak in this situation. And this makes sense when you think about it. Your adductors add your leg back to your body. If your adductors are too tight or overactive, they will add your leg back too much, which can cause this inward collapse at the knee. This is also commonly referred to as knee valgus or knock knees. You're going to get a few questions about it, so let's break it down more. We've already talked about knees caving in a few different instances. We already talked about that before with the overhead squat, with the single leg squat, and we just talked about it a little bit more. NASM actually has a term for it, or a name for it. It's called pes planus distortion syndrome, and it will almost certainly come up on your test in one form or another. So with this distortion syndrome at the ankle, you're going to see a collapsed arch. At the knee joint, you're going to see those knock knees, which you can kind of see right here, and they're a little bit internally rotated. This is usually the most obvious thing, and it's usually how this is initially found. And then at the hip, you're going to see extra adduction. Again, those legs being added to the body a little too much, like we just talked about. And we're going to see internal rotation as well. Well, I guess we just can't escape these overactive and underactive muscles. For better or worse, this is a huge part of your test. Again, not everything is necessary to memorize, but if you understand how this stuff works well enough, you'll be able to pick it up on a multiple choice question. And that is really what is essential here. Like we just kind of said a few times now, the adductors are going to be overactive in that situation. Gastroc and soleus, those calf muscles, also going to be overactive. And the hip flexors are typically going to be overactive in this situation as well. Well, since the gastroc and soleus were overactive, we can make a safe bet that the tibialis muscles, the muscles on the opposite side, they're going to be underactive. And we kind of see the same thing with the hip flexors. They oftentimes oppose hamstrings and glute muscles, and that's kind of what we see right here. So next up, we're going to be talking about the pushing and pulling assessments. For both of these two assessments, the client should be standing in a narrow split stance. The client should be doing about 10 reps with challenge, but we're not looking for exhaustion. And with both of these two assessments, we're viewing things from the side. So we're looking at the lumbo-pelvic hip complex, the shoulders, the cervical spine, or kind of like that upper back neck area, and the head. So looking at this slide, I wanted to be clear that these two assessments are very similar, and the compensation patterns that we're going to go over for these two assessments are very similar as well. And here we are looking at the setup for the pushing assessment. Here you can see Alexis, and she's pushing 2 cables right ahead here. She's in a split stance, so this is what it would look like doing a pushing assessment. And a pulling assessment, again, is pretty much the same exact thing, except this time we're pulling. Again, we're doing roughly 10 reps, and we're kind of just seeing how our client moves during those 10 reps, again, whether they are pushing or pulling. And like we said before, the weight here is not meant to be that heavy. A little bit of challenge should be there, but we're not looking for exhaustion. So back to our overactive and underactive muscles. In this case, you can see Alexis's head is just a little bit too far forward beyond her shoulders here. So the overactive muscles in this case would be the levator scapula, which that muscle's job is to elevate the scapula, pushing everything up and usually a little bit forward. We also have the SCM, the sternocleidomastoid, which is a neck muscle. So again, that's overactive. We also have the cervical spine extensors. All of those things, again, being overactive when someone's head is too far forward during either of these two assessments. And then for underactive, we have the deep cervical flexors, and that should be no surprise because they oppose these cervical spine extensors. So if we're doing a pushing or a pulling assessment and someone's shoulders are too high or their scapula is too high, the overactive muscles typically are going to be the levator scapula, again, elevating the scapula too much, and the upper traps. And then for underactive, we have the lower traps. They're usually going to be underactive, and oftentimes the upper traps are going to be overactive. So always keep that in mind with all these different patterns. And our last compensation pattern for both the pushing and pulling assessment is when you have a low back arch, which we can kind of see a little bit of a low back arch right here on Alexis. And none of these overactive muscles should be too surprising at this point. We have the hip flexors, which really the TFL, the psoas, and the rectus femoris are the main ones that we're thinking about there. We also have the lumbar extensors. And anytime we have too great of a lordotic curve back here, we can pretty much bank on these muscles here being underactive. So in this case, the underactive muscles are glute max, glute medius, and the abdominals. And again, that's going to happen pretty much any time that we have too great of a lordotic curve right here in the lower back. Okay, so all of that being said, what is overactive if the shoulder is elevated and the head is forward? Kind of like what we're seeing right here. Would the overactive muscles be A, the lower traps and lats, B, the levator scapula and cervical spine extensors, C, the rhomboids and pecs, or D, the upper traps and rhomboids? Take a second to think about it. Since these muscles are overactive, they're too tight, and we do want to stretch them out. So if the shoulder is elevated and the head is forward, B, the levator scapula and the cervical spine extensors, those muscles would be the most overactive, so that's the right answer. So the lower traps are basically never overactive, so we can rule out answer A here right away. The lats could be overactive, but again, doesn't matter because we have lower traps right here. The rhomboids are also basically never overactive. They're pretty much always going to be underactive, just like the lower traps. Both of these two always underactive, so C cannot be the correct answer. The upper traps would be overactive here, but again, we have the rhomboids, and they are pretty much never overactive. So B is the best answer. The levator scapula would be overactive. Its main job is to elevate the scapula, and as you can see, everything is elevated there, and the cervical spine extensors, her head is too far forward. So yeah, both of those two things are true. So we're going to be switching gears and talking about some different types of assessments now. For some of the upcoming assessments, you'll need to take a client's pulse. There are two spots you should consider while doing this. You have the carotid artery and the radial artery. And the radial artery is this one right here, and the carotid artery is this one in the neck right here. So the radial artery is going to be the one that you would actually use because this is a little bit invasive. You don't really want to be touching too many people like this. The radial artery artery or this one on the wrist, that is the one that you're going to want to go with. So a normal male heart rate is between 60 and 70 BPM, beats per minute. For females, it's a little bit higher, 72 to 80 BPM. If a client's heart rate is 5 beats higher than their typical resting heart rate for a period of a few days, they may be overtraining, and that would be a reason to ease up on training. So bradycardia is when someone's heart rate is less than 60 BPM or beats per minute, and tachycardia is when someone's heart rate is higher than 100 BPM or 100 beats per minute. When it comes to taking a client's heart rate while they're exercising, you're going to want to measure their heart rate for 10 seconds and then multiply that heart rate number by 6 to get BPM or beats per minute. Moving right along to the max push-up assessment, and this is a muscular endurance assessment. It is not a strength assessment. The max push-up assessment is a muscular endurance assessment. So in this assessment, men do full push-ups and women do kneeling push-ups, and the client is going to lower to 90 degrees at the elbow. Kneeling push-ups are allowed if standard is not possible, 60 seconds time frame or to exhaustion. That's how long this is going to go on for. And the person's hands are going to be slightly wider than shoulders. Next up, we have the bench press assessment, and this is going to be used to estimate 1 rep max for the bench press. This one is a strength assessment. So the client is going to grasp a barbell with their hands slightly greater than shoulder width apart. Their low back should be in a neutral position. You want to avoid excessive arching. There's a whole protocol for how this bench press assessment works. We'll be breaking that down in a sec. Next up, we have the squat strength assessment, and as the name would imply, it is a strength assessment. In this one, the client should stand with their feet approximately shoulder width apart. The knees should be in line with the toes. Comfortable weight should be used for the warm-up and the initial repetitions. So before I start breaking down the protocol for the squat and bench press assessments, let me also say that for the squat assessment, the bench press assessment, push-up assessment, and a lot of the upcoming assessments as well, you do not need to memorize every piece of information. I'm just covering the basics. Listen along to what I say and retain as much information as you can. Anyways, for the squat and bench press assessments, you have some steps here. The first thing you want to do is after the warm-up, the client is going to complete 3 reps. After those 3 reps, your client is going to take a 2-minute rest. For the bench press, you'd add 10 to 20 pounds or 5 to 10% of the initial load. And for squat, you'd add 30 to 40 pounds or 10 to 20% of the initial load. And then essentially after that, you'll be repeating steps 1 through 3. So having your client do 3 reps, having him take a break, and then adding weight until you can't add any more. And then from there, you would use charts in your book to figure out your client's estimated 1 rep max. On to the vertical jump test, and this is useful with athletes who will be jumping, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This is going to assess lower body extremity power and jump height, and your client has up to 3 attempts, and there will be 2 minutes rest between each attempt. We also have the long jump or the broad jump test, and it's designed to test maximal jump distance and lower extremity horizontal power. So in this one, your client is going to start standing behind a line on 2 legs, so they're not getting a running start or anything like that. Again, they're starting standing behind a line on 2 legs. The client has up to 3 attempts, and there's 2 minutes rest between those attempts. Next up, we have the left test or the lower extremity functional test. This one assesses agility, neuromuscular control, acceleration, and deceleration. So in the left test, you have clients sprint, side shuffle, do karaoke, and backpedal between 2 cones. Next up, we're talking about speed, agility, and quickness drills for youths or adolescents. So I don't think these numbers are worth memorizing, but they are good for you to hear, could pop up on the test, so just listen and retain as much as you can. So the number of days per week that you'd be doing SAQs with youths would be 1 to 3 days per week. The number of drills you'd be doing on those days would be 4 to 8. You'd be doing 1 to 4 sets for those different drills. You'd be doing 3 to 5 reps of those drills, and the rest periods would be 15 to 60 seconds long. Unlike the numbers, this is probably worth memorizing. Red light, green light is an SAQ drill for youths. Make sure you know that, as is follow the snake. Both of these 2 are for youths. So moving on to speed, agility, and quickness drills for seniors. And really there's no numbers here to memorize, there's just 2 different drills. There is the varied size cone or hurdle step overs. And again, we don't really need to know exactly what that is. Basically, it's going to be old people stepping over hurdles or cones. There's also the stand up to figure 8, and we don't need to know exactly what it is, but the stand up to figure 8 That is an SAQ drill for seniors. Basically, it's when a client is seated in a chair and they're going to go in a figure 8 position when the trainer tells them to. This number right here doesn't have anything to do with SAQs, but it does have to do with seniors, and I would memorize this one. So for seniors or older people, 40 to 80% 1 rep max for basic resistance training, that is what they should be lifting. 40 to 80% 1 rep max for seniors when it comes to resistance training. So we have the 40-yard dash. That tests reaction capabilities, acceleration, and maximal sprinting speed. The 40-yard dash is 100% a speed assessment. Next up, we have the Pro Shuttle assessment, and this assesses acceleration, deceleration, control, and agility. It is definitely an agility assessment. You'll also see it called the 5-10-5 assessment. The Pro Shuttle assessment, again, we said that one is agility. The 40-yard dash, again, we said that one is speed. Both of those two are considered advanced. You would not be doing them with most clients. So a VO2 max assessment is the most valid measurement of aerobic fitness. It's also known as maximal oxygen uptake or peak VO2. This is not something that will be done with typical clients, and that's because it requires a whole bunch of different equipment, but still, it is the most valid measurement of aerobic fitness. So resting VO2 or resting energy expenditure, I just want you to memorize this number right here. 3.5 milliliters per kilogram of body weight. Memorize this number, 3.5 milliliters per kilogram of body weight. That is resting VO2 if you do get a multiple choice question on that. Next up, we have the YMCA 3-minute step test, and that is 3 minutes of stepping on a 12-inch step to a 96 step per minute cadence. So after 3 minutes, you're going to take someone's pulse within 5 seconds post-test to determine aerobic fitness. And this one is possibly good for deconditioned clients, and that's because it's not terribly difficult. Still a 12-inch step though, and it could be too difficult for some people, so this is one you're going to have to think about if it shows up on the test. Next up, we have the Rockport Walk Test. It is a 1-mile walking test to predict VO2 max. It's appropriate for new exercisers, and that's just because you're walking. It's not as good for fit individuals, again, because you're walking, you're not running. It can be done on a treadmill, and your heart rate, or the heart rate after the test, is going to determine VO2 max estimates. Next up, we have the 1.5-mile run test. This is best for fitter clients. It estimates aerobic fitness levels by scoring the individual's time performance where their heart rate responds, which is used to estimate VO2 max. And again, it's best for fitter clients because you're running 1.5 miles, which, yeah, most people can't do that. So now we're moving on to sequencing assessments. There is an order to which you'd want to do these assessments. So pre-participation, things like the PAR-Q or the health history questionnaire, those would be what you would do first. Physiological assessments would be second. Blood pressure is the most obvious example. You want to do that very early on because some of these things can raise a person's blood pressure. Third, you'd be doing body composition assessments, things like skin calipers, bioelectrical impedance. We'll be talking about both of those very shortly. Next up, you'd be doing postural and movement assessments. Think things like the overhead squat. After that, you'd be doing cardio assessments, so that 1.5-mile run test, the Rockport Walk Test, things like that. And then last, you'd be doing performance assessments. These ones are more intense. Think things like the 40-yard dash. So when it comes to RPE, or rating of perceived exertion, there's two different ways you can calculate that. You have a 1 to 10 scale, 1 being super easy, 10 being super hard. You also have the Borg scale, which is a 6 to 20 scale. Now, I don't think it's worth memorizing what each individual number means. For example, I don't think you necessarily need to know that 11 means fairly light, but if you know a 6 is very easy and a 20 is incredibly hard, you should be able to guess and figure out pretty accurately what each number means. So based on what I just said, if I asked you what does an RPE of 17 feel like, you might not know it's very hard, but you're going to know it's pretty damn challenging because 17 is close to 20. So now we're covering the talk test, VT1 or ventilatory threshold 1, and VT2 or ventilatory threshold 2. So the talk test is an informal cardiorespiratory assessment where a client's ability to hold a conversation is gauged. VT1 or ventilatory threshold 1 is the point at which the body uses equal amounts of carbs and fats for fuel, so 50-50. VT1 occurs when breathing becomes clearly audible, basically you can hear somebody breathing, with fairly visible signs of ribcage elevation. So VT2, or ventilatory threshold 2, this is for individuals with performance-centric goals. This level is so intense the client can't verbally respond to a question, or they have to respond with single-word answers such as no. The only thing I would memorize on this page is make sure you know what the talk test is. VT1, VT2, just have a general understanding of what they are. Same goes for this page. Nothing on this page is worth memorizing, but it's definitely a good one to look over. So when it comes to cardio, according to NASM, there's 4 different zones for us to think about. First up, we have zone 1, and it's pretty light. So basically, you're going to be working at a 3 to 4 out of 10, or a 12 to 13 on that 6 to 20 scale. And in this zone, you are starting to sweat, but you can talk effortlessly. So the intensity here is below VT1, which we just talked about VT1. That is the point at which the body uses equal amounts of carbs and fats for fuel, and VT1 occurs when breathing becomes clearly audible. Basically, you can tell when someone's working really hard, and yeah, zone 1 is just not quite that intense. Next up, we have zone 2, and this is where intervals become possible. You're working at a 5 or 6 out of 10, or a 14 to 15 on the 6 to 20 Borg scale. Here you have noticeable sweating, and talking is becoming tough. And in zone 2, you're working at VT1 to that midpoint between VT1 and VT2. Moving on to zone 3, and zone 3 is a bit advanced. This one is a 7 or 8 on a 1 to 10 scale, or a 16 to 17 on that 6 to 20 scale. In this one you have profuse sweating, and the ability to talk is limited to short phrases. Next up you have zone 4, and very few people would be going into zone 4. Maybe some athletes and some people who are really trying to push the envelope. It's a 9 to 10 on that 1 to 10 scale, also an 18 to 20 on that 6 to 20 scale. And in this one you'd be breathing as hard as possible, and speaking is impossible or very limited. And in zone 4 you'd actually be above VT2. Next up we're talking about blood pressure, and in this one you do need to have a pretty good idea of what's going on. So normal blood pressure is less than 120/80, and this top number is the systolic number, and this bottom number is the diastolic number. Elevated blood pressure would be where your systolic number is between 120 to 129. So if your number is 120 all the way up to 129, your diastolic number would still have to be less than 80. Stage 1 hypertension or high blood pressure would be where your systolic number is between 130 and 139, or your diastolic number is between 80 and 89. Either of these two things here would put you in stage 1 hypertension. And then stage 2 hypertension would be where your systolic, or that top number, is 140 or higher, or the bottom number, the diastolic number, is 90 or higher. This is one to either memorize or at the very least know it well enough to answer a multiple choice question correctly. Moving on to BMI, or body mass index, BMI has nothing to do with body fat percentage, it just has to do with height and weight. So here are 2 different formulas you could use to calculate someone's BMI. I wouldn't bother memorizing either of these 2. If you're going to get a BMI question where you have to calculate someone's BMI, they're almost certainly going to provide that formula for you. These numbers down here I would memorize though. 18.5 to 24.9, that is the good BMI range, that's where you want to be. If someone's BMI is lower than 18.5, that's not good, they're underweight, or their BMI is too low. If your BMI is between 25 and 29.9, you'd be considered overweight, and if your BMI is 30 or higher, that would be obese. Of course, now we are talking about body fat, so we have some healthy body fat ranges. For men, you want to be between 10 and 20%, and for women, you want to be between 20 and 30%. This is definitely one to memorize. So next we have bioelectrical impedance, or BIA, and this determines body composition based on the rate at which an electrical current travels through the body. Sounds very fancy, but whenever you're holding on to one of those devices or standing on a scale that's telling you body fat, it's using this BIA, or bioelectrical impedance technology. Anyways, body fat or adipose tissue causes greater resistance or impedance than fat-free mass, which would be muscle, bone, things like that, and it slows the rate at which the current travels. Yeah, basically if you show up to this dehydrated, you're going to come up as fatter than you actually are. That's because water conducts electricity in your body. Moving on to skin calipers for body fat. So there's a few different ways you can use skin calipers with your clients. NASM primarily focuses on the simple foresight Durnin-Womersley formula. So basically you'd be measuring your client at 4 different sites: the biceps, the triceps, subscapular or right beneath the scapula, in the iliac crest, and you'd be taking 2 measurements for each of these spots and then getting the average of those 2 measurements. By the way, these measurements are always done on the right side of the body. And you don't want to use skin calipers on obese clients. It's not super accurate with obese clients, and they're probably not going to feel all that comfortable. So yeah, no skin calipers on obese clients. So waist circumference 39.3, sometimes you're going to see it rounded up to 40 in men, and 35.4, sometimes rounded to 35 in women. Either of these two waist circumferences would be a risk factor. There's also waist to hip ratio, and to get waist to hip ratio, all you have to do is divide someone's waist measurement by their hip measurement. So 1.0 or higher would be a risk factor for men, and 0.86 or higher would be a risk factor for women. Now we're moving on to one of my favorite sections, nutrition. In talking about nutrition, it's always important to keep in mind that we are personal trainers, not dietitians. We don't develop meal plans for clients, and we don't do medical nutrition therapy. That being said, we can do things like help our clients to understand food labels, what certain nutrients do in the body, etc. Also, we can use the dietary guidelines developed by the government and the recommendations from myplate.gov. If there is a question about what you can legally do as a personal trainer nutrition-wise, the answer most often will have to do with the US dietary guidelines or myplate.gov. It won't be uncommon for a question to come up where the best thing for you to do would be to refer the client to a registered dietitian. For example, if a client has diabetes and they want to lose weight, even if it's something that you could help them with, the correct thing to do would be to refer them to a dietitian. Definitely for this test, and most likely when you're in the field working as well, when in doubt, refer the client to a dietitian. One thing you need to memorize is, download this thing into your brain, 1 gram of protein is 4 calories, 1 gram of carbohydrate is 4 calories, and 1 gram of fat is 9 calories. 1 gram of protein is 4 calories, 1 gram of carbohydrate is 4 calories, and 1 gram of fat is 9 calories. Also, fun fact, 1 gram of alcohol is 7 calories, and also fiber is not a macronutrient. Do not let them trick you with any fiber macronutrient questions on the test. You also have micronutrients, which are vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients. There's complete and incomplete proteins. Complete proteins provide all essential amino acids. Animal and dairy proteins fall into this category. There's incomplete proteins, and these are missing 1 or more amino acids. Plant proteins would fall into this category. Moving on to macronutrient RDAs, or recommended dietary allowance, you have protein, carbs, and fats. Those are the 3 macronutrients. Anyways, when it comes to protein, 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight for sedentary adults and 10 to 35% of daily calories. That's what you're looking at for sedentary adults when it comes to protein. When it comes to carbs, 3 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight for lightly active adults, or 45 to 65% of daily calories. That's what should be coming from carbohydrates. And then for fat, 20 to 35% of total calories in any given day should come from fat. Saturated fats should only make up 10% or less of total calories. These percentages right here for fat, 20 to 35%, for carbs, 45 to 65%, for protein, 10 to 35%, worth either memorizing or just knowing well enough to get a multiple choice answer correct. Knowing 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight for protein, and then 3 to 5 grams per kilogram for carbs, also really good to know. Also, saturated fats should only make up 10% or less of total calories. Good to know. So if you're an athlete or a pretty serious lifter, you are going to want to get extra protein and carbs. So when it comes to protein, 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram of body weight for endurance athletes. 1.2, this should say 1.7, not 17, should say 1.7. So 1.2 to 1.7 for strength athletes, and 1.4 to 2.0 for bodybuilders. I've seen these numbers vary a little bit, even, on NASM's blog posts and in their book. But again, these are rough estimates for protein intake for athletes. And then when it comes to carbs, a lot of athletes are going to want to consume 8 to 10 grams per kilogram. Good to know. So there's 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. That means a 500 calorie daily deficit would get you roughly a pound of fat loss every week. Next up, we're going to be talking about fats. So first up, we have monounsaturated fats. These are heart healthy. Think things like olive oil, avocado, and peanuts. Then we have polyunsaturated fats, and we'll be talking about omega-3s first. These are heart healthy, and you can get these from fish, flaxseed, and some dairy as well. When you're getting omega-3s from plants, it's in the form of ALA, which is tougher to absorb than what you get from fish, for example. You also have saturated fats, and the health benefits here are unclear. They definitely might be unhealthy depending on who you ask. You do want to limit consumption, and remember what we talked about before, 10% or less of total calories should be coming from saturated fats, and some saturated fats would be animal fat, full fat dairy, and coconut. So trans fats are artificial. Typically they are made in a lab or something like that, margarine, things like that, for example, and they are bad. So you have fat-soluble vitamins and water-soluble vitamins. Fat-soluble vitamins are things that you can take too much of because they are stored in fat tissue. So the fat-soluble vitamins are A, D, E, and K. I repeat, the fat-soluble vitamins are A, D, E, and K. When it comes to the water-soluble vitamins, you can't really overdose on those. You typically would just pee out any excess. And there you have the C and B vitamins. So the major minerals are calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, sodium, potassium, chloride, and sulfur. So when it comes to sugars, you have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Monosaccharides are simple. They can't be broken down anymore. So monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Disaccharides are two monosaccharides joined together. Sucrose and maltose would be examples there. And polysaccharides are more complicated. You have long chains of glucose units, glycogen, fiber, starch, those would be examples there. All right, so when it comes to hydration, there's a few things for us to talk about. So the morning of the event or the evening before, you should be consuming 16 ounces of water. You should also be having 13 to 20 ounces right before the actual event itself. During exercise, it's recommended that you consume 12 to 16 ounces every 10 to 15 minutes. A sports drink is recommended for over 90 minutes, and that's because sports drinks have electrolytes inside of them. So after exercise, you should be drinking 1.25 times the amount of weight lost in sweat, and then you should also be consuming sodium and electrolytes. So now we're moving on to random stuff worth knowing. A lot of what's coming up next we've already talked about. We're just going to go into more detail, or I'm going to be asking you different questions about it. And some of the upcoming stuff we haven't covered at all yet. So we've already talked about nervous system stuff, but hey, it's good to break it down again. The nervous system has two main components, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is mostly under our control. It mostly involves skeletal muscle and things like that. The autonomous or autonomous nervous system is automatic, as the name would imply, meaning it is not under our control. So the autonomous nervous system is split into two parts. You have the sympathetic nervous system, which controls our fight and flight response, and you have the parasympathetic nervous system, which has to do with resting and digesting. So static stretching is you or your client holding a stretch for roughly 30 seconds. Could also be longer than that. Any old school stretch where you're holding it for 30 seconds or longer, that is a static stretch. We also have dynamic stretching. These are movement patterns designed to mimic the workout itself. You would typically be doing these in phase 5 power of the OPT model. So if I'm doing bodyweight squats or prisoner squats or Frankensteins or anything like that, that's typically going to be considered dynamic stretching. You also have ballistic stretching, and it's kind of like dynamic stretching, except it's a lot more ballistic and crazy. There's a lot of bouncing and swinging going on. Typically, this is one to avoid. So when it comes to exercises, there are open kinetic chain exercises and closed kinetic chain exercises. For open kinetic chain exercises, the distal part of the body moves. So some examples would be curls, leg extensions, or bench press. If we're looking at the leg extension, the distal part of the body or the knee and ankle are moving. In a closed kinetic chain exercise, the distal part of the body is stationary. So if I'm squatting, for example, my feet are planted to the ground. Same thing is true for a push-up or a hip bridge. So this might be pretty obvious to most of you watching, but it's still good to say. If something questionable comes up in a session, like your client sharing too much information about their divorce, the correct thing to do would be to redirect the focus of the conversation back to the workout. Now this next one is good to know because it could pop up in one form or another on the big test. It's also just good information for all trainers to have. So remember, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that's how you're going to remember how many vertebrae you have in each part of the spine. So you have your 7 cervical vertebrae up top. Again, 7 cervical vertebrae, and those are the ones up top. And what time do you eat breakfast at? Of course, you eat breakfast at 7 a.m. You have 7 cervical vertebrae. Again, I repeat, 7 cervical vertebrae, breakfast at 7 a.m. Next up, you have the thoracic spine, and that's kind of this mid-back area right here. What time do you eat lunch at? You eat lunch at 12, so therefore you have 12 thoracic vertebrae. Again, 12 thoracic vertebrae in the mid-back right here. And in the lower back, you have the lumbar area or the lumbar spine. What time do you eat dinner at? You eat dinner at 5 p.m. Therefore, you have 5 lumbar vertebrae. And then when it comes to the sacral area and the coccyx, you really don't need to memorize those. You have 5 sacral vertebrae. They're actually fused together, so it's kind of all like one big mass. Again, 5 fused sacral vertebrae. Don't need to memorize that. The coccyx is your tailbone, and that is at the very bottom. So when it comes to running a personal training business, or really any type of business, you have a sole proprietorship, and that is a business owned by an individual. And in a sole proprietorship, that person has no protection. So the owner has no protection in that sole proprietorship. What NASM recommends is an LLC, a limited liability corporation, and that does provide the owner some protection. To create an LLC, forms are required, but they are relatively simple compared to something like an S-Corp or a small corporation. If you are going to start your own personal training business, you do want to start up an LLC. They're quick and they're easy, and they do provide a lot of protection. So an independent contractor is a self-employed person or entity contracted to perform work for or provide services to another entity as a non-employee. As a result, independent contractors must pay their own Social Security and Medicare taxes. So if you're an independent contractor, you work for yourself, you don't have a boss, you might just be renting space somewhere. A worker is an employee when the business has the right to direct and control the work performed by the worker. This includes hours worked, uniforms, etc. In most personal training jobs, you will be an employee. You'll be working for some big box gym. They're going to give you a uniform, and they're going to tell you what hours they want you to work, and basically they're going to tell you how they want you to do the job. Now we're going to be talking about the 3 parts of a plyometric exercise, or the stretch shortening cycle. We haven't really talked about this with plyometric exercises in particular, plyometric exercises being jumping exercises, but we have talked about it with more typical resistance training exercises. Anyways, part 1 of a plyometric exercise, or the stretch shortening cycle, is the eccentric phase. Essentially, this is where the main muscles are lengthening. It's also called the deceleration or loading phase, and as you can see this person lowering down to the bottom part of a jump squat, that would be eccentric. And the reason it would be eccentric is because as that person is descending down into the bottom portion of a jump squat, those main muscles are lengthening out or stretching. Okay, so part 2 is the amortization phase, and this is the transition phase, or the delay between the eccentric and concentric phase. So if I pause for a fraction of a second at the bottom of a jump squat or even a bench press, that'd be the amortization phase. And then the third part of a plyometric exercise, or the stretch shortening cycle, would be the concentric phase, and that is the shortening phase where the energy is released. And we can see that here with the liftoff from this jump squat. So there are 3 stages of the general adaptation syndrome. Stage 1 is the alarm reaction, and this is your initial reaction to a stressor. Think the fight or flight response. Stage 2 is resistance development, and this is when your body increases its functional capacity to adapt to the stressor. And then stage 3 is exhaustion. If the stressor is intolerable and continuous, eventually this will lead to breakdown and injury. So the SAID principle is a good one to know. The body will adapt to the specific demands placed on it. And then when it comes to the SAID principle, SAID stands for specific adaptation to imposed demands. Yeah, that makes sense. So when it comes to resistance training routines, there's a whole bunch of different ways in which you can order your different exercises. There is the single set system, and this is performing 1 set of each exercise. There is the multiple set system, and this is performing multiple number of sets for each exercise. There's the pyramid, and this is increasing or decreasing weight with each set. You also have supersets, and this is when 2 exercises are completed back to back with minimal rest between those moves. There's complex training. This is a multi-joint and heavy compound lift followed by an explosive move. There's drop sets. This is performing a set to failure, then lowering the weight and continuing on. There's the giant set. This is performing 4 or more exercises in a rotation with minimal rest. And then there's circuit training, and this is a series of exercises back to back with minimal rest. You have split routines. This is where you're training different parts of the body on different days. You have vertical loading, and this is training starting with the upper body, then working your way down to the lower body. There's horizontal loading. This is doing all the sets of an exercise or body part before moving to the next one. Then you also have the peripheral heart action system, and we have a description for this one on the next page. page, because this one I tend to find people get questions on it just a little bit more often. In this system, you alternate between upper and lower body exercises. And it's thought that training this way can be really good for circulation, lowering blood pressure, and just burning lots of calories. We talked about this a little bit in the part 1 video. Kids are able to perform endurance tasks pretty well. That being said, they have decreased glycolytic enzymes compared to adults. This decreases their ability to do longer duration, high intensity tasks. Kids also have less resistance to heat, humidity, and environmental extremes. On to the 4 P's of marketing, and this is definitely a good one to know. You have product, place, price, and promotion. So when it comes to product, you do want to communicate the benefits of using the product or the service. When it comes to place, we're thinking about the place or the method of distribution. So where are you actually going to be training people? When it comes to price, you do want to identify a competitive price. And then when it comes to promotion, how are you going to promote or market your service? Moving on to the SWOT analysis, and SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So strength could be any competitive advantage you have, might be your education, your certification, your skills, or really anything else. Weaknesses could also be anything. If you're doing a SWOT analysis on yourself and your business, be honest, where are you weak? Where do you have to improve? O stands for opportunities, identify opportunities, weaknesses can improve. Yeah, so if you're not good at sales, work on sales, get better at them, and you will do better over time. The last part of the SWOT analysis are threats. What could impact your business? Could a major downturn in the economy really be a problem? Is there a lot of competition in the area? Things like that are important to know about. So when it comes to calculating your annual income, there are 3 steps. The first step is to identify your desired yearly income. How much money do you want to make in a year? Step 2 is to figure out what income is needed weekly to get you there. So how much money do I have to make every week to get to that desired yearly income? And then step 3 is to estimate the weekly session count required to achieve the weekly income in step number 2. So there's a few types of medications that I'll see pop up on these tests here and there. Not a ton, but here and there. So we have beta blockers and diuretics. And these 2 things are both blood pressure medications. So when it comes to beta blockers, these lower your heart rate at rest and during exercise. A client's heart rate won't raise the same way during exercise when they're on a beta blocker. You also have diuretics, and these increase the excretion of water from the body through the kidneys. This could increase the likelihood of dehydration. So there's 2 types of diabetes. You have type 1 and type 2 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, these people have to inject insulin. They are insulin dependent. People usually develop this early on. When it comes to type 2 diabetes, these people are insulin resistant. This one usually comes from poor lifestyle choices, so this one is a lot more common. If you meet someone and they have diabetes and they don't have good dietary habits, it's a lot more likely they have type 2 diabetes. So glycogen is the stored form of glucose that's made up of connected glucose molecules. This is the one that is stored inside of your body and broken down and turned into ATP. Gluconeogenesis is the process of how glucose is created within the body. Protein can be used in this process. So when it comes to muscle contraction, we have the all or nothing principle. Muscles or motor units either contract fully or not at all. So if a person is doing a light bodyweight squat, some of their quadricep muscle fibers wouldn't fire, but the ones that are firing 100%. Heavier squat would recruit more muscle fibers. Neuromuscular specificity refers to the speed of muscle contraction and the exercise selection. So neuromuscular specificity, speed of contraction, and the exercise selection itself. Mechanical specificity refers more so to the weight and movements that are applied to the body. So when it comes to cholesterol, you have LDL or bad cholesterol and HDL or good cholesterol. So LDL or bad cholesterol carries cholesterol through the bloodstream and it kind of like lays it down in your bloodstream. HDL or good cholesterol, these remove cholesterol from the bloodstream, and that's good. You don't want that cholesterol in your bloodstream. So osteoporosis is a bone disease that causes bones to become weak and brittle, increasing the risk of fractures. Osteopenia is a decrease in bone mineral density that's not severe enough to meet the diagnostic criteria for osteoporosis, but it's getting there and it is a concern, so just keep all of that in mind. Integrated training is a training principle that combines all forms of exercise, think flexibility, cardio, resistance training, etc. When a potential client says yes to signing up for personal training, when should their first appointment be scheduled? The answer is within 48 hours. Exercises on the floor where you're laying on your back or supine are contraindicated for pregnant people after the first trimester and for people with hypertension or high high blood pressure. And since we have a person doing a bridge down here, a common mistake that people make while bridging is raising their hips too high, which can cause hyperextension in the lower back. Keep all of that in mind. I've seen questions asked about that in particular. Okay, so some more recommendations. For obese people, at least 5 days per week of cardio, 60 to 80% of heart rate max for 40 to 60 minutes on those days. When it comes to pregnant people, 3 to 5 days a week of cardio, 40 to 50% heart rate max, and this would be non-weight bearing, so think things like a recumbent bike where you're seated. Weight bearing would be something like a treadmill where you're standing and having to bear your weight. So DOMS stands for delayed onset muscle soreness. Usually this begins to develop 12 to 24 hours after exercise and is most intense 24 to 72 hours later. And while we're talking about that, the eccentric portion of the lift where the prime mover or agonist is stretching, again, think the bench press, where I'm lowering the bar and my pec major is stretching out. This is the part of the lift that causes the most soreness, so just keep that in mind. NASM likes to ask questions about that. So to calculate someone's max heart rate, you simply do 220 minus their age. So if you have a 20-year-old person, it would be 220 minus 20, and their max heart rate would be around 200. Know that the heart rate reserve formula is the Karvonen formula. Don't really need to go into any more detail on that. Stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart's left ventricle with each beat, and then cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. The only thing I would memorize on this page is that 220 minus your age is your max heart rate. Everything else, I would just have a good idea of what it is. So in the part 1 video, we talked about local and global core muscles. We're going to get into a little bit more detail on both of these guys right now. So the local core muscles do something called drawing in, and the global core muscles do something called bracing. I repeat, the local core muscles do something called drawing in, and the global core muscles do something called bracing. So for the local core muscles and drawing in, engaging the transverse abdominis is the main local core muscle, and basically you do this for increased pelvic stabilization. So think about laying on your back and trying to really squeeze those deeper core muscles and trying to pull your belly button in close to your spine. The core marching exercise is an example of where you'd be doing this. So bracing is a co-contraction of global muscles such as the rectus abdominis and the external obliques. It's also called bearing down. So if I'm just kind of squeezing my abs a little bit as I'm crunching, that is bracing. So this is actually one to memorize right here. You need 2.0 or 2 CEUs, continuing education units, to renew your NASM CPT certification. Probably not worth memorizing, but you do get 0.1 for your AED CPR first aid. Now we're going to jump into some trivia questions, which should help all of you to download this information into your brains. These questions will be similar to ones that you would see on a final NASM exam. So let's say your client is in phase 1 of the OPT model. What rep, rest, and tempo scheme is most appropriate? Is it A, 12 to 20 reps, 60 seconds rest, and a tempo of 4-2-1-1? B, 12 to 20 reps, a rest of 60 seconds, and the tempo of 2-0-2-0. C, a rep count of 15 to 18 reps, rest of 90 seconds, and a tempo of 4-2-1-1. Or D, in phase 1, would you have your client doing 12 to 20 reps, resting for 90 seconds, and then doing that tempo of 4-2-1-1? Take a second to think about all of these answers, and yeah, questions like this do require you to memorize some parts of the OPT model. We did say in that part 1 video that that is something that you're going to have to do. So the correct answer here is D. If your client is in phase 1 of the OPT model, stabilization endurance, they would be doing 12 to 20 reps, they would be taking 90 seconds for rest, and the tempo is 4-2-1-1. I don't love questions like this because, again, it's just memorization, but if we look here, stabilization endurance, and this is a slide from the part 1 video, reps 12 to 20 for resistance training. Here is the tempo, 4-2-1-1. And then if we look at the next slide, rest is 0 to 90 seconds. Again, this sort of question is just memorization. There are going to be some questions like that. This sort of question right here really shouldn't be memorization though. So your client is squatting down to the ground. What muscle actions are taking place? I will say it's actually a pretty tricky question in some ways. So as your client is squatting down to the ground, hip flexion and knee flexion is taking place. That is the correct answer, so it's B. Watch what's happening here at the knee, hip, and ankle as she squats down. Those joint angles are decreasing, right? Yeah, this joint angle is getting smaller as she goes down, and when the joint angle is getting smaller, you're looking at flexion. And having that knowledge makes it really easy to rule out these other answers. Can't be A, C, or D, because you can see hip extension in all three of those different answers. Hip extension would occur as the client is lifting out of the bottom of the squat because the joint angle is then increasing. This is about when the client is squatting it downwards to the ground. It's not when they're coming back up. So again, a little bit of a tricky question, but if you know about joint angles and what flexion and extension are, you can pretty easily figure this one out. And this is something that we covered in detail in this part 2 video. So this is happening to your client when squatting, knees caving together. What is overactive and what's underactive? If we have knees caving together during a squat, would the overactive muscles be the hip adductors and the underactive be the hip abductors? Would the overactive muscles be the hip adductors and the under be glute max? Would the overactive muscle be the gastrocnemius and the underactive be anterior tibialis? Or would the overactive muscles be the hip abductors and the underactive be the hip adductors? The messed up thing about this question here is there is actually 2 right answers to this. That being said, one of these 2 answers is the better answer, and NASM loves throwing questions like that at you guys. So yeah, this is good practice for what is yet to come. Okay, so the best answer here is A. The overactive muscle will be the hip adductors, and the underactive muscles would be the hip abductors. So answer D here is just wrong. In fact, it's exactly the opposite of what's true. When this is happening when someone is squatting, the adductors, which bring the leg back to the body, are adding the leg back too much. They're overactive, and the abductors, like glute medius, are underactive. You know what? This question is even worse than I thought, because this answer, answer C, and answer B could actually both be correct as well. The gastroc could definitely be overactive, and the anterior tib could definitely be underactive. They just don't have too much to do with knee collapse. Answer B could also be correct. The hip adductors would be overactive, and most likely glute max would be underactive. However, glute max, while probably underactive, doesn't have as much to do with knees caving in. That's more glute medius, which is a hip abductor, making A the best answer. Well guys, like I said, NASM loves questions where there's a few possible answers that make sense, but one of them is the best. For better or worse, that previous question was one like that. So what tempos occur in the second phase of the OPT model, strength endurance? And hopefully you guys remember this from that part 1 video, but phase 2 of the OPT model, strength endurance, is a strength move followed by a similar stabilization move. So now that I've given you that small hint, which of these 4 answers do you think is the best? The best answer here is A, the 4-2-1-1 and 2-0-2 tempos. Those are the ones that are happening in the strength endurance phase, which is that second phase of the OPT model. So since in phase 2 strength endurance we're dealing with a strength move followed by a stabilization move, this one should be kind of easy to figure out. 2-0-2, that is the tempo that you're using for strength moves in phase 2 and phase 3 of the OPT model. And then the 4-2-1-1 tempo, that is the tempo that you're using for stabilization exercises, and we've talked about that a good amount already. So how many balance or core moves should you have your client do in phase 1 stabilization endurance? A, 1 to 3 for both, B, 1 to 3 for core and 4 to 5 for balance, C, 4 to 5 for both, or D, the client will decide the day of the session. And yeah, this is another OPT memorization question. Most likely you'll get a few of those. So the correct answer here is A, 1 to 3 for both. You would be doing 1 to 3 core and balance moves in phase 1 stabilization endurance. This answer here is just kind of silly, so we can rule this one out. But yeah, in phase 1, it's 1 to 3 for core, balance, and other types of training. In phase 2, it's 2 to 4. In phase 3, it's 2 to 4 for core and balance, and 3 to 6 for resistance training. It's 2 to 4 again for core and balance moves in phase 4. For regular resistance training, it's 4 to 6 sets here. And in phase 5 power, core and balance moves are optional, which is unique to that phase. By the way, it's also 3 to 5 sets for resistance training exercises in phase 5. So let's say you have a female client who's 23% body fat and may have an eating disorder, and they ask you for weight loss advice. What should you do? Should you A, tell them your weight is perfect, don't worry, B, kindly refer them to a registered dietitian, C, tell them they need to be in a caloric deficit, or D, tell them to reduce their carbohydrate intake? Take a second to think about it. Multiple okay answers here. One is definitely the best though. The best answer here is B, kindly refer them to a registered dietitian. When in doubt, refer out. So answer A isn't that bad. Tell them your weight is perfect, don't worry. I mean, hey, at least it's a positive thing to say. And they are 23% body fat, which is good for a female. For a female, you're supposed to be between 20 and 30%. That being said, it's not really up to you to decide if their weight is perfect or not. if they have a possible eating disorder, they really should talk to a licensed professional. And yeah, if someone was trying to lose weight, they would need to be in a caloric deficit. But again, if they have a possible eating disorder, it's probably not something for you to recommend to that person. And of course, that same logic would apply to answer D here as well. So guys, referring back to this page from the part 1 video, read these chapters, skim these chapters, take some light notes along the way, and do the NASM practice quizzes and the practice test. Those NASM chapter quizzes and the practice test are helpful. Take them multiple times each. In my opinion, you should be averaging 80% or higher on the practice quizzes and the practice exam itself. Make sure you watch this part 1 video and this part 2 video at least a few times each. I don't want to brag, but if you watch these videos a few times each, you absolutely will better understand the key NASM concepts. I strongly recommend the Pocket Prep application. I'll leave a link to that down below. If you sign up for 3 months, it's $16.99 a month. It's a good deal. There's 1,000 questions on there. By the way, using my link for that down below does help to support this channel. Also, I will be uploading multiple NASM trivia videos that should really help nail those key concepts even more than we already have. These will be partially free, and the part that I do charge for will be inexpensive. They're coming very soon, and I know they will be helpful for many of you since I will personally be walking you through exam question scenarios and explaining why some answers are right and others are wrong, kinda like what I did at the end of this video, but way more of that. If any of you have any questions on preparing for the big test, leave those down below in the comments. I will respond to you. Before I go, I just want to say good luck to all of you. Not that you'll need it. You guys are my people, and because of that, I know you're going to keep studying and grinding until you pass. And if you, yes you, watching this video right now, keeps consistently working hard, you will pass. So keep working hard, everyone. I love you guys. Thank you so much for watching. On your way out of here, please don't forget to like and subscribe because it really does help out the channel. And until next time, stay sort of healthy.